Sorry. Greetings, fellow insomniacs. It's your friend in fright, good old Chunky Larry, and I've been meaning to make this video series for some time now. I was having a discussion about 90s horror. It's often looked at as being kind of a shit decade for the horror genre, and there's tons of reasons for that I intend to try to explore over the course of this 10-part series called Horror in the 90s. And basically what I want to do is I want to go through the years one by one from 1990 to 1999 and look at what happened to the horror genre. Now, in order to do that, I think it's important that we do a little bit of backtracking. So most audiences, most fans, most horror purists cite the 80s as a very special decade, and that's largely due to the surge in popularity, specifically for the slasher genre, though there's a myriad of different types of titles, and at some point I'll definitely do one of these on the 80s, but I felt like the 90s are often overlooked because of the 80s. The 80s was big, it was loud, it was colorful. There was a culture birthed from Reagan and Reaganomics that was counterculture. So we got films that were kind of punk rock, but inevitably, just like punk rock, the powers that be, the people who write the checks, throw enough money and it becomes just like everything else. Towards the turn of the 90s, the end of the 80s, turning into the 90s, you start to see that. And I feel like 1990 specifically is kind of the spillover of the dying of 80s horror, specifically the slasher genre, with franchises becoming kind of the norm with things like Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Hellraiser, Child's Play. We still had that mindset that was the way that horror was meant to be consumed, in kind of these big overarching stories that didn't necessarily have to have any kind of connective tissue. Ultimately, what that brought about was an oversaturation of the market and a disinterest, by and large, for a lot of what was so popular in the 80s. So you started to see characters that were mainstays throughout the 80s being killed off. Freddy, Jason, and to a lesser extent Pinhead, and the other kind of people in that orbit, the monsters in that orbit. You also are coming to the tail end of the AIDS epidemic, and that being a very real, very horrifying part of our minds. It made things weird. So where in the early 80s, within the slasher genre, it was a lot of frivolous sex and violence, and then sex became violence. I fully intend to go through all of this kind of bit by bit with historical elements, and so the 10-part series is going to be one of these where I talk about kind of what's going on in that period of time, but I'm also going to be doing a list, and it'll be a ranking list of the horror films that were released in 1990 or 1991, so forth, so on. Look forward to my top 10 horror films of 1990. That'll be releasing very soon. But until then, continue to listen with someone you trust.